Evan Mitchell had always envisioned his post-college life as a grand adventure. So when he inherited Ellsworth Manor, an old estate on the outskirts of a quiet town, he embraced it with a mixture of excitement and curiosity. The manor, a sprawling Gothic structure, loomed over the landscape with its ivy-clad walls and weather-beaten turrets. Evan was eager to make it his own, seeing it as the perfect canvas for his new beginnings. As he drove up the winding path to the manor, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, sinister shadows across the estate. The mansion, though majestic, seemed to exude a quiet, unsettling aura. Its empty windows stared blankly into the twilight, and the overgrown garden was choked with weeds and creeping vines. Inside, the manor was just as imposing. Dust danced in the beams of the setting sun, filtering through the grime-smeared windows. The grand foyer, with its creaking wooden floors and faded tapestries, spoke of forgotten splendor. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and disuse. Evan unpacked with a growing sense of unease, the manor's silence broken only by the occasional groan of settling timber. That night, as Evan lay in the large antique bed in the master bedroom, he could hear the house settling around him. The groans and creaks seemed to resonate with a peculiar rhythm, as if the manor was breathing. His attempts to dismiss the sounds as natural noises of an old house were met with increasing discomfort. As he drifted into a restless sleep, he was unaware that his new home harbored secrets that were far from benign. The following morning, Evan awoke to the sound of chirping birds and a muted sunlight filtering through the tattered curtains of the master bedroom. He stretched and yawned, still feeling the weight of yesterday's unsettling aura. Determined to make the best of his new surroundings, he decided to explore the manor more thoroughly. The idea of uncovering hidden rooms and forgotten treasures filled him with a sense of adventure, despite the vague sense of unease that clung to him. Descending the grand staircase, he noticed how the wooden banister felt unusually cold under his fingertips. The house seemed to have its own character, one that was old and wise, but decidedly unwelcoming. The sun's rays illuminated the dust motes in the air, giving the manor a ghostly, ethereal quality. As Evan walked through the expansive ground floor, he couldn't help but feel as though the manor was watching him, its silence almost oppressive. He came upon the dining hall, a vast room with a long, heavy table covered in dust. The grand chandelier overhead, now merely a relic of its former glory, cast twisted shadows on the walls. Evan ran his hand along the table, disturbed by the chill that seemed to emanate from it. He noticed a set of old portraits hanging on the walls, their subjects staring down at him with stern, lifeless eyes. The eyes seemed to follow his every move, intensifying his growing sense of discomfort. His exploration led him to the basement door, a heavy oak panel that creaked ominously as he pushed it open. The basement was a realm of darkness and decay, its musty odor hitting him like a physical force. A single bulb, dangling from the ceiling by a frayed cord, flickered intermittently, casting eerie, quivering shadows across the walls. The steps leading down were narrow and steep, and as Evan descended, he felt a cold draft sweeping up from below. The basement was a cavernous, dimly lit expanse filled with relics of the past. Old trunks, broken furniture, and scattered boxes lay haphazardly around the room. Dust-covered sheets draped over ancient items like ghostly shrouds. The air was stale, heavy with the weight of years of neglect. Evan's footsteps echoed loudly, amplifying every sound and adding to the feeling of isolation. He explored the basement cautiously, his flashlight beam darting around the room. His heart pounded as he stumbled upon a large, tattered curtain that seemed out of place amid the chaos. The curtain was moth-eaten and hung unevenly, blocking a section of the room from view. Driven by a mix of curiosity and trepidation, Evan pulled the curtain aside, revealing a small alcove that seemed to harbor an unsettling presence. In the alcove stood an old, ornate mirror, its once gilded frame now tarnished and covered in layers of dust. The mirror was strangely pristine amidst the decay surrounding it. Evan's flashlight illuminated its surface, and he noticed a faint, pulsing glow emanating from it. As he approached, he felt a sudden, icy chill seep through the air, causing him to shiver involuntarily. The mirror's surface seemed to ripple, almost as if it were alive and reacting to his presence. Evan stared at the mirror, feeling an inexplicable pull. The shadows around him seemed to shift and twist, and for a moment, He could have sworn he saw figures moving in the mirror's reflection. His breath quickened and he took a hesitant step back, his eyes never leaving the mirror. The basement, once merely old and dusty, now felt as though it harbored a malevolent force. Unable to shake the overwhelming sense of dread, Evan turned away from the mirror and ascended the stairs quickly. The basement door slammed shut behind him with a resonant thud echoing through the stillness of the manor. As he stood at the top of the stairs, he glanced back one last time, his pulse racing. The eerie glow from the mirror seemed to linger in his mind, casting a long, dark shadow over his thoughts. The sun had barely risen when Evan awoke the next morning, his sleep interrupted by uneasy dreams of shadowy figures and echoing whispers. His nerves were frayed from the previous day's unsettling discovery in the basement. Determined to shake off the sense of foreboding, he resolved to continue exploring the manor. He hoped that immersing himself in the house's history would help him understand its strange atmosphere. He started his day with a hearty breakfast, though the old kitchen seemed to offer little comfort. The room was a relic from another era, filled with antique appliances and cracked tiles. The heavy wooden cabinets, adorned with intricate carvings, were filled with faded, dusty crockery. The old stove and sink were grimy and unused, their surfaces covered in a layer of grime. Evan noticed that even the kitchen seemed to have a cold, lifeless quality, as though it had not been touched in decades. After breakfast, Evan decided to explore the second floor, a place he had avoided until now. The staircase leading up creaked with every step, and the hallway at the top was lined with closed doors, each one seemingly guarding its own secrets. The second floor felt even more oppressive than the first, with its heavy draperies and dusty, cobweb-laden corners. The air was mustier here, filled with a sense of abandonment that was almost palpable. He opened the first door he came to, revealing a large bedroom that had clearly once been beautiful. The ornate four-poster bed, draped in moth-eaten silk, dominated the room. Antique furniture, including a vanity with an ornate mirror and a large armoire, stood in various states of disrepair. The wallpaper, once vibrant, was now peeling and faded. Dust lay thick on every surface, and the room had an unsettling stillness, as if it were frozen in time. As Evan moved through the room, he noticed a small door tucked away behind a large wardrobe. It was partially hidden by the shadow of the furniture and looked as though it hadn't been opened in years. With a sense of growing curiosity, he pushed the wardrobe aside and turned the handle of the door. It creaked open slowly, revealing a narrow staircase leading to the attic. The attic was even more daunting than the basement. The stairs were steep and treacherous, and the dim light from his flashlight barely penetrated the thick darkness. The air grew colder as he climbed. The temperature dropped, creating a chilling effect that made his breath visible in the air. When he finally reached the top, he was greeted by a vast, cluttered space filled with old trunks, broken furniture, and layers of dust. The attic had an eerie quality of its own. Old family portraits, their faces blurred by time and grime, lined the walls. The photographs depicted stern-looking individuals with vacant eyes, their expressions hauntingly indifferent. In the center of the room, an old rocking chair sat motionless, its creaking barely audible over the quiet. It seemed out of place, almost as if it had been set there intentionally. Evan began to sift through the items scattered around the attic, hoping to find something that might explain the manor's strange atmosphere. He opened one of the trunks, revealing a collection of yellowed letters and faded photographs. The letters were written in elegant script but were mostly indecipherable due to their age. Among the photographs, he found one that stood out, a portrait of a young woman with hauntingly familiar features. Her eyes seemed to follow him, and an inexplicable sense of recognition washed over him. As he continued to explore, Evan felt a growing sense of dread. The attic's oppressive silence was occasionally broken by faint, unsettling noises, the distant sound of something scratching or shuffling. His flashlight flickered erratically, casting jittery shadows that danced across the walls. He could feel a presence, an almost palpable tension in the air that made every movement feel heavy and deliberate. A sudden, cold draft swept through the attic, making the dust swirl in the beam of his flashlight. The temperature dropped sharply, and Evan felt a chill run down his spine. He glanced around nervously. The once familiar attic now feeling like an alien and menacing space. His anxiety mounted as he noticed that the shadows seemed to deepen and stretch, creating twisted, grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for him. Despite his growing fear, Evan felt compelled to investigate further. He moved toward a large, ornate mirror that stood against one wall, covered in a heavy layer of dust. As he approached, the mirror's surface seemed to reflect an unsettling, flickering light. The shadows in the mirror appeared to writhe and change shape, almost as if something were trying to emerge from within. His heartbeat quickened, and he fought the urge to flee. The reflection in the mirror began to distort, showing dark, shadowy figures moving behind him. Evan turned around rapidly, but the attic remained empty. The unsettling feeling that he was not alone persisted, and he could hear what sounded like whispers coming from every corner of the room. Overwhelmed by a sudden wave of nausea and fear, Evan decided it was time to leave. He hurried down the attic stairs, the creaking steps echoing loudly in the silence. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each step. He slammed the attic door behind him, hoping to shut out whatever malevolent force seemed to lurk in the shadows. Returning to the first floor, Evan tried to calm himself. The manor's oppressive atmosphere seemed to follow him, its silence now louder and more menacing. He sat down in the grand foyer, attempting to steady his nerves. The house seemed to be waiting, its very presence heavy with an unspoken threat. The mirror from the attic and the shadowy figures that had haunted his vision lingered in his mind, leaving him with an unsettling sense of dread that he couldn't shake. The night had settled into an eerie quiet, as Jack Rivers, a 21-year-old recent college graduate, found himself alone in his family's sprawling suburban home. It was supposed to be a peaceful evening, a rare moment of solitude in a house usually bustling with activity. His parents were away on a weekend trip, and his younger sister was spending the night at a friend's place. Jack, relishing the thought of a quiet evening, had planned to catch up on some reading and maybe watch a few movies. But as the night wore on, the comforting stillness began to morph into something more unsettling. The house was large, almost too large for a family of 4, with long, winding hallways and rooms that were seldom used. It was a typical suburban home, with wide windows that offered views of the neatly manicured lawn outside and a backyard that stretched out into the darkness. Jack had grown up here, and every creak and groan of the old house was familiar to him. Yet tonight, something felt different. The usual sense of security that the house provided was replaced by an inexplicable unease. It began subtly, with a slight creak of the floorboards upstairs. Jack was lounging on the couch in the living room, the TV casting a soft glow across the room, when he heard it. He paused, listening intently, but the sound didn't repeat. He shook it off as the house settling. After all, it was an old place, and noises like that were common. He returned his attention to the movie, trying to focus on the plot, but his mind kept wandering back to the sound. The quiet moments stretched on, the only noise being the low hum of the television. The house seemed to grow quieter, the silence becoming almost oppressive. Jack's eyes kept drifting toward the darkened hallway that led to the stairs. The shadows seemed to deepen, taking on a more menacing quality as the minutes ticked by. Another sound broke the silence. This time, it was a faint thud, like something had fallen or been knocked over. Jack's heart skipped a beat. He muted the TV and listened, his ears straining to catch any other noise. The house was silent once more, but now the silence felt charged, like it was waiting for something to happen. Jack tried to calm himself, reminding himself that he was alone in the house. There was no one upstairs, no one who could have made that noise. Maybe it was the wind, or perhaps something had just toppled over on its own. He decided to investigate, if only to put his mind at ease. He grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness as he made his way toward the stairs. The wooden steps creaked under his weight, each one sounding louder in the quiet of the night. The upstairs hallway was dark, with only a faint sliver of moonlight filtering through the window at the end. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he moved forward, his footsteps cautious and deliberate. The hallway stretched out before him, with closed doors on either side leading to the various bedrooms and the bathroom. He reached the top of the stairs and paused, listening intently. The house was silent again, but the air felt heavy, as if something was lingering just out of sight. Jack walked down the hallway, his flashlight casting long, wavering shadows against the walls. He checked each room one by one, starting with his sister's. It was exactly as she had left it, with clothes strewn about and posters of her favorite bands adorning the walls. The next door led to the guest bedroom, a space rarely used but always kept tidy. It, too, was empty, the bed made up neatly with crisp sheets. Jack felt a bit foolish as he moved to the next room, his own. He pushed open the door and flicked on the light, flooding the room with a warm glow. Everything was in its place. His bed, his desk cluttered with papers and books, and his clothes piled on a chair in the corner. The final door was the bathroom, and as Jack opened it, he felt a cold draft brush past him. The small window was slightly ajar, letting in the cool night air. He closed it, the latch clicking into place, and took a deep breath. There was nothing to worry about, he told himself. The house was empty, just as it should be. Yet, as he turned to leave the bathroom, a sudden chill ran down his spine. It wasn't the cold air, this was something deeper, a feeling that something was very wrong. Jack's instincts screamed at him to leave, to get out of the house, but he hesitated. He glanced around the bathroom one last time, his eyes landing on the mirror above the sink. For a brief moment, he thought he saw something move in the reflection, a dark shadow passing behind him. He spun around, his flashlight beam darting across the bathroom, but there was nothing there. The fear that had been a slow, creeping sensation now tightened its grip on him. He quickly exited the bathroom and headed back downstairs, his steps quicker and more urgent. The house seemed to groan in response, the old floorboards creaking in protest as he descended the stairs. Back in the living room, Jack tried to shake off the unease. He turned the TV back on, hoping that the familiar sounds and images would calm his nerves. But the feeling of being watched, of not being alone in the house, wouldn't leave him. The shadows seemed darker, the silence more oppressive, and every small noise made his heart race. He tried to distract himself by scrolling through his phone, but the screen only served to illuminate the darkness around him, casting eerie reflections on the windows. He felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the house itself was watching him. His mind raced, trying to come up with logical explanations, but the fear was overwhelming. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second seeming to stretch into eternity. Jack's eyes kept darting toward the hallway, where the darkness seemed to pool like ink. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Another noise broke the tension, a faint, rhythmic tapping sound, like someone lightly drumming their fingers on a wooden surface. It was coming from the direction of the basement door. Jack froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The basement was a place he rarely went, a dark, musty space filled with old boxes and forgotten items. The tapping continued, steady and insistent, growing louder with each passing second. Summoning what little courage he had left, Jack stood up, his legs shaky and weak. He knew he had to check the basement, if only to prove to himself that there was nothing to be afraid of. He walked slowly toward the door, each step feeling like a journey into the unknown. The tapping stopped as he reached the door, leaving a suffocating silence in its wake. With trembling hands, Jack turned the doorknob and slowly opened the door. The darkness below was thick and impenetrable, the faint glow of his flashlight barely making a dent. He took a deep breath and started down the stairs, each creak of the old wood sending shivers down his spine. The basement was colder than the rest of the house, the air damp and heavy with the scent of mildew. Jack reached the bottom of the stairs and swept his flashlight across the room. The basement was as he remembered it, cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and random junk that his family had accumulated over the years. But something felt off, as if the shadows were shifting, moving ever so slightly when he wasn't looking. He moved further into the basement, his heart pounding in his ears. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was almost worse. It was as if the basement was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jack's eyes darted around, searching for anything out of the ordinary, but the flashlight only illuminated more darkness. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw it. A flicker of movement, a shadow darting across the far wall. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he turned the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. His mind raced, trying to rationalize what he had seen, but the fear was overwhelming. He felt the darkness closing in on him, the shadows seeming to stretch and reach for him. In a panic, Jack turned and ran back up the stairs, his feet pounding against the old wood. He slammed the basement door behind him and leaned against it, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. The house was silent again, but the oppressive atmosphere remained. He could feel it pressing down on him, suffocating him, filling every corner of the room with a sense of dread. He knew he wasn't alone in the house, and whatever was there with him, it wasn't friendly. The fear that had started as a slow, creeping sensation had now blossomed into full-blown terror. Jack's mind raced, trying to figure out what to do, but the only thing he could think of was to leave. He needed to get out of the house to escape whatever was lurking in the darkness. But as he reached for his phone, the power went out. The house was plunged into complete darkness, the only light coming from his flashlight. The sudden silence was deafening, and the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. Jack's heart raced as he realized that he was truly alone, with no way to call for help and no way to see what was lurking in the shadows. The fear was overwhelming, paralyzing him as he stood there, frozen in place. He knew he had to move to find a way out, but his body wouldn't respond. The darkness pressed in on him, and the silence was broken by a soft, whispering voice that seemed to come from all around him. It was a voice he didn't recognize, but it was filled with malice, dripping with hatred. Jack's blood ran cold as the voice grew louder, more insistent, echoing in his mind. He tried to move, but his legs felt like they were made of lead. The darkness seemed to close in on him, suffocating him until he felt like he was drowning. The whispering voice was all he could hear now, filling his mind with terror, driving him to the brink of madness. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the voice stopped. The darkness seemed to recede slightly, and Jack found himself able to move again. His heart was pounding in his chest, his breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. He didn't know what had just happened, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to get out of the house, and fast. But as he turned toward the front door, he realized with a sinking feeling that he wasn't alone. The darkness in the hallway seemed to shift and move, and out of it stepped a figure. It was tall and shadowy, its features obscured by the darkness, but its presence was unmistakable. Jack's heart skipped a beat as he stared at the figure, unable to move or speak. The figure stood there, silent and menacing, its eyes, if it had any, boring into Jack. The air around him grew colder, and the oppressive atmosphere seemed to intensify. Jack knew he was in the presence of something malevolent, something that wanted to do him harm. He tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't cooperate. The figure took a step forward, and Jack felt a surge of terror like he had never known. The figure's movements were slow, deliberate, as if it was savoring the fear it was causing. Jack's mind raced, trying to figure out what to do, but the fear was overwhelming. He was trapped, with nowhere to run and no way to fight back. As the figure drew closer, Jack realized that this was no ordinary intruder. There was something supernatural about it, something otherworldly. He could feel its malevolence radiating off of it, like a dark cloud that enveloped him. The figure reached out, its shadowy hand extending toward him, and Jack knew that if it touched him, it would be the end. In a last desperate act, Jack turned and bolted for the stairs, his only thought being to get away from the figure. He raced up the stairs, his feet barely touching the steps as he fled. But the figure was right behind him, its presence pressing down on him like a weight. Jack could feel its cold breath on the back of his neck as he reached the top of the stairs and darted into his bedroom. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his heart pounding in his chest. He backed away from the door, his eyes wide with fear as he listened for any sign of the figure. The house was silent again, but Jack knew it was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting for him. He backed into the corner of the room, his flashlight shaking in his trembling hands. He didn't know how long he could hold out, but he knew he had to try. The figure was out there, and it wanted him. The fear was overwhelming, but Jack knew he couldn't give up. He had to survive, no matter what. The darkness seemed to press in on him from all sides, and Jack could feel the figure's presence getting closer. He knew it was only a matter of time before it found him, before it broke through the door and took him. But Jack was determined to fight, to survive, no matter what. He wouldn't go down without a fight, and he wouldn't let the figure win. And so he waited, his heart pounding in his chest, his eyes fixed on the door. The darkness was all around him, and the figure was out there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. But Jack was ready. He would survive this night, no matter what it took. He had to. Jack sat huddled in the corner of his bedroom, the door locked, and his heart still racing from his terrifying encounter. The darkness in the room seemed thicker, more oppressive than before, as if the very walls were closing in on him. His flashlight flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced eerily across the room. He tried to steady his breathing, to calm his racing thoughts, but the memory of the figure in the hallway was still fresh in his mind. It was like nothing he had ever encountered, an entity made of pure malevolence. Jack had always been skeptical of the supernatural, but now there was no denying that something was terribly wrong with this house. The oppressive silence was suddenly broken by a faint creaking sound. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he strained to listen. The sound was coming from outside his bedroom door, a slow, deliberate creak of floorboards as if someone or something was moving just beyond the threshold. Jack's pulse quickened as he stared at the door, waiting, listening. The creaking stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Then a low, guttural growl echoed through the room, reverberating off the walls. The sound was deep, inhuman, and filled with a primal rage that sent a chill down Jack's spine. He knew the figure was on the other side of the door. He could feel its presence, a heavy, suffocating darkness that seemed to seep through the cracks. Jack gripped the flashlight tightly, knowing it was his only weapon, though he had no idea how he could use it to defend himself against something so otherworldly. Suddenly, the door rattled violently, as if something was trying to force it open. Jack jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. The rattling grew more intense, the door shaking on its hinges as if it was about to be torn off. Jack scrambled to his feet, backing further into the room, his mind racing with fear. "Leave me alone!" he shouted, though his voice trembled with fear. "Just leave me alone." But the rattling didn't stop. If anything, it grew louder, more frantic, as if the entity was becoming more desperate to get inside. The growling grew louder too, more aggressive, filling the room with a sense of impending doom. Jack's mind was spinning, trying to figure out what to do. He had to get out of the room, out of the house, but the only way out was through the door, and the malevolent presence that waited just on the other side. He could feel the darkness closing in on him, threatening to consume him. Then, as if in response to his thoughts, the rattling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, more terrifying than the noise had been. Jack stood frozen, his ears straining for any sound, his eyes locked on the door. But there was nothing, just an eerie, unnatural quiet. Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. He didn't trust the silence. It was too sudden, too complete. The figure was still out there, he could feel it, but it was waiting, biding its time. Jack knew he couldn't stay in the room forever. He had to make a move before the figure decided to strike again. Slowly, he edged toward the door, every muscle in his body tense, ready to bolt at the slightest sound. He reached out with trembling hands and placed them on the doorknob, pausing for a moment to steady his nerves. Then, with a deep breath, he unlocked the door and flung it open. The hallway beyond was dark, the shadows deep and impenetrable. Jack hesitated, his heart hammering in his chest, but there was no turning back now. He stepped into the hallway, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The air was thick with tension, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Jack moved cautiously down the hallway, his senses on high alert. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind made him jump. The house was eerily quiet, too quiet, as if it was waiting for something. Jack's flashlight flickered again, casting strange, shifting shadows that seemed to dance just out of reach. As he reached the top of the stairs, Jack paused. He could see the front door from where he stood, just a few yards away. It was so close, yet it felt like a mile. The thought of making a run for it crossed his mind, but something held him back. A nagging feeling that the figure was still watching, waiting for him to let his guard down. Just as he was about to take a step forward, a cold breeze swept through the hallway, extinguishing his flashlight. Jack gasped in the sudden darkness, his heart pounding wildly. He fumbled with the flashlight, desperately trying to get it to work, but it was dead. The darkness was absolute, oppressive. Jack could feel the malevolent presence closing in on him, the air growing colder by the second. He was blind, vulnerable, and he knew the figure was near. His only option was to make a run for it. Gathering all his courage, Jack sprinted down the stairs, his feet barely touching the steps. He reached the front door and grabbed the handle, yanking it open with all his strength. But the door wouldn't budge. It was as if an invisible force was holding it shut. Jack's panic surged. He pulled and pulled, but the door remained firmly closed. He was trapped. He turned around, his back against the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness in the hallway was moving, shifting, and out of it emerged the figure. It was closer now, more defined, its shadowy form looming over him. Jack could feel its hatred, its desire to harm him. He was cornered, with no way out, and the figure knew it. The growling returned, low and menacing, filling Jack with a sense of dread unlike anything he had ever felt. In a last desperate attempt to save himself, Jack closed his eyes and began to pray, hoping that somehow, some way, he would be spared. But the figure was relentless. It moved closer, its cold, shadowy hand reaching out toward him. And then, just as it was about to touch him, a blinding light filled the hallway. Jack's eyes snapped open in shock as the darkness was driven back, the figure recoiling as if in pain. The light was warm, comforting, and it pushed the malevolent presence away, forcing it to retreat into the shadows. Jack didn't know where the light had come from, but he didn't care. He scrambled to his feet and threw himself at the door again, this time feeling it give way. He burst out of the house and into the night, gasping for air as he ran as fast as he could away from Grimm Farm. He didn't stop running until he reached the safety of his car, parked at the end of the long gravel driveway. He jumped inside and locked the doors, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. He started the engine and sped away, not daring to look back. As he drove down the dark, winding road, Jack's mind was reeling. What had happened back there? What was that figure? And where had the light come from? He didn't have the answers, but one thing was certain. He had narrowly escaped with his life. But as he drove, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the malevolent presence wasn't gone. It was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for another chance to strike. And deep down, Jack knew that this was far from over. The haunting of Grimm Farm had only just begun. Jack's foot slammed the gas pedal to the floor, the old car careening down the narrow, winding road that led away from Grimm Farm. The tires screeched against the asphalt as he sped through the night, the dark trees on either side of the road blurring into a menacing wall of shadows. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The cold air rushing through the open windows did little to calm his racing heart. The night felt endless, every minute dragging on as the oppressive darkness outside pressed in on him. Jack's mind raced, replaying the events of the last few hours over and over, trying to make sense of what he had experienced. But no matter how he turned it over in his mind, he couldn't shake the image of that shadowy figure looming over him, its presence so palpable, so malevolent. He couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it, but he knew it was real. He could still feel the chill that had settled deep into his bones, the feeling of being watched, hunted. It was as if the very air around him had turned against him, suffocating him with its intensity. The fear gnawed at him, a relentless force that refused to let him go. Jack's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure following him, but the road behind him was empty. The inky blackness of the night seemed to swallow up everything in its path, leaving only the dim glow of his taillights to mark his passage. But even though he couldn't see it, he could feel it. Something was still out there, lurking in the darkness, watching him. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, though he had no idea how much time had passed since he fled the farmhouse. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Time had lost all meaning in the wake of his terror. All he knew was that he had to keep moving, to put as much distance between himself and that cursed place as possible. But as Jack continued to drive, a creeping sense of unease began to settle over him. The road seemed to stretch on forever, winding through the dense forest with no end in sight. The trees loomed tall and dark on either side, their gnarled branches reaching out like twisted hands. The headlights of his car barely penetrated the thick darkness, casting only a feeble glow on the pavement ahead. A feeling of dread began to build in the pit of his stomach. The further he drove, the more he felt as though he was being drawn deeper into something sinister, something he couldn't escape. It was as if the road itself was conspiring against him, leading him in circles, trapping him in a never-ending nightmare. Jack's grip on the steering wheel tightened as he leaned forward, his eyes straining to see through the darkness. The road began to twist and turn more sharply, the curves becoming more treacherous with each passing mile. The car's tires screeched in protest as he took a particularly sharp turn, the vehicle skidding dangerously close to the edge of the road. And then, without warning, the car's engine sputtered and died. The dashboard lights flickered and went out, plunging Jack into complete darkness. The car coasted to a stop, the silence that followed almost deafening in its intensity. Jack sat frozen in his seat, his heart pounding in his chest as the realization of what had just happened slowly sank in. "No, no, no," he muttered, his voice shaking as he frantically turned the key in the ignition. The engine groaned but refused to start. He tried again and again, but it was no use. The car was dead. And Jack was stranded in the middle of nowhere. Panic surged through him as he looked around, the darkness outside pressing in on him from all sides. He was completely alone, miles from the nearest town, with no way to call for help. The thought of stepping out of the car and into that suffocating blackness was almost too much to bear. But then he felt it, that same cold, suffocating presence that had haunted him at the farmhouse. It was stronger now, more intense, as if the darkness itself was alive, watching him, waiting for him to make a move. Jack's breath hitched in his throat as he felt the temperature inside the car drop, the windows beginning to fog up from the cold. He could feel the malevolent force closing in on him, and he knew he couldn't stay in the car. As terrifying as the thought of stepping into the darkness was, staying put felt even more dangerous. Summoning all his courage, Jack reached for the door handle, his hand trembling as he pushed it open. The cold night air rushed in, chilling him to the bone as he stepped out of the car. The forest around him was eerily silent, the only sound the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. The darkness was so thick he could barely see his own hand in front of his face. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to get back in the car, to lock the doors and wait for daylight, but he knew that wasn't an option. He had to move, had to find a way out of this nightmare. But as he took his first tentative steps away from the car, he felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. The darkness around him seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, the air growing heavier with each step he took. And then he heard it, a low guttural growl, deep and menacing, coming from the darkness behind him. Jack froze, his heart skipping a beat as he slowly turned to look. But there was nothing there, only the impenetrable blackness that surrounded him. But the growl came again, closer this time, vibrating through the air with a primal, inhuman intensity. Jack's breath caught in his throat as he realized that the figure had followed him, that it was hunting him. He could feel its eyes on him, could sense its hatred, its desire to hurt him. Panic surged through him as he began to run, his feet pounding against the pavement as he fled into the darkness. The growling grew louder, more aggressive, echoing through the trees as the figure gave chase. Jack's lungs burned with the effort, his heart racing as he pushed himself to run faster, to get away from the thing that was pursuing him. But no matter how fast he ran, the growling only grew closer, the malevolent presence almost suffocating in its intensity. Jack's legs felt like lead, his muscles burning with exhaustion, but he didn't dare stop. He knew that if he slowed down, even for a second, the figure would catch him. His mind was a blur of fear and desperation as he darted through the trees, the branches scratching at his skin as he stumbled over the uneven ground. The darkness was absolute, disorienting, and Jack had no idea where he was going. All he could do was keep moving, keep running, hoping that somehow he would find a way out. But then, as he rounded a bend in the road, Jack saw it, a faint, flickering light in the distance. It was small, barely visible through the trees, but it was there, a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. Jack's heart leaped with relief as he pushed himself to run faster, his feet pounding against the ground as he made a beeline for the light. But Jack couldn't stop. He kept running, driven by the primal instinct to survive. Every step forward felt like a struggle against the encroaching darkness, the forest itself seeming to conspire with the entity that hunted him. His muscles screamed in protest, his mind teetering on the edge of collapse, but still, he pressed on. And then, just when he thought he couldn't take another step, Jack saw it. A faint glimmer of light ahead, different from the eerie glow of the figure. It was warm, flickering like the flame of a distant fire. For a moment, hope surged within him. Maybe there was a way out. Maybe he could still escape. But as he pushed through the last of the thick underbrush and stumbled into a small clearing, his heart sank. The light was coming from a single old lantern hanging from a gnarled tree. The ground around it was bare, the grass scorched and blackened as if burned by fire. And there, standing just beyond the lantern's reach, was the figure, waiting for him. Jack's breath hitched in his throat as the figure stepped forward, the light of the lantern casting long, grotesque shadows across its twisted form. Its glowing eyes locked on him, and for the first time, Jack saw its face, or what was left of it. The features were distorted, barely human, a mask of rage and despair twisted by some unimaginable force. There was no escape. Jack knew that now. This thing, this entity, had been toying with him, leading him deeper into its domain, into a trap from which there was no return. The figure raised its hand, and the air around Jack grew colder, the oppressive force pressing down on him with crushing intensity. He fell to his knees, his strength finally giving out as the darkness closed in on all sides. In that final moment, as the figure loomed over him, Jack understood. This was the end. There was no more running, no more fighting. The darkness had won, and then, with one final violent lunge, the figure descended upon him and everything went black. Jack stumbled over a root, falling hard to the ground. Pain shot through his ankle, but he gritted his teeth and forced himself back up. He had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of the thing that was chasing him. But his body was betraying him, exhaustion setting in, his muscles burning with every step. Ahead, he saw a break in the trees, a clearing dimly lit by the faint glow of the moon. He pushed himself toward it, hope flaring in his chest. Maybe there, in the open, he could find some way to escape, some way to fight back. But as he broke through the tree line and stumbled into the clearing, his hope died. The clearing was small, surrounded on all sides by the dark, twisted trees. The ground was bare, the earth black and lifeless. And in the center of the clearing stood a decrepit, crumbling structure, barely recognizable as a building. The remnants of an old chapel, its walls overgrown with ivy, its windows shattered, stood as a silent sentinel in the night. Jack's heart sank as he realized where he was. He had heard stories about the old chapel, rumors whispered by the locals about its dark history. It was said that the chapel had once been the site of unspeakable rituals, that the land around it was cursed. But those were just stories, weren't they? The oppressive darkness pressed in around him, the air growing colder by the second. Jack took a hesitant step forward, his eyes locked on the chapel. He could feel the malevolent presence all around him, but it was strongest here, in this place. It was as if the chapel was the source of it all, the heart of the darkness that had pursued him. He had no choice. Whatever was happening, whatever was hunting him, it was connected to this place. If he wanted to survive, if he wanted to put an end to this nightmare, he had to confront it here. Jack limped toward the chapel, every step a battle against the overwhelming sense of dread that threatened to paralyze him. The ground beneath his feet was soft and uneven, the earth seeming to shift and writhe as if alive. The growling had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that only deepened his fear. As he reached the entrance to the chapel, Jack hesitated. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, the wood rotten and splintered. The darkness inside was impenetrable, a void that seemed to swallow all light. But he knew he had to go in. Whatever answers he sought, whatever force had been tormenting him, it was inside. Steeling himself, Jack pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the walls damp and crumbling. His footsteps echoed hollowly in the confined space, the sound unnerving in the stillness. The interior of the chapel was small, barely more than a single room, with a low ceiling and broken pews scattered haphazardly across the floor. But it was what lay at the far end of the room that drew Jack's attention. A stone altar, darkened by age and stained with something he didn't want to think about. Candles, long since extinguished, were arranged in a circle around it, their wax melted into grotesque shapes. And above the altar, carved into the stone wall, was a symbol that sent a chill down Jack's spine. The symbol was ancient, its meaning lost to time, but it radiated an aura of malevolence, of power. Jack could feel the energy pulsing from it, could hear a faint whispering in the back of his mind, as if something was calling to him, beckoning him closer. He approached the altar, his heart pounding in his chest. The closer he got, the stronger the whispering became, until it was a roar in his ears, drowning out all other thoughts. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the cold stone of the altar. And then the world around him exploded into chaos. The walls of the chapel seemed to ripple and twist, the darkness within them coming alive. Shadows poured out from the corners, swirling around Jack, their forms shifting and changing. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping to an unbearable level. Jack's breath fogged in front of him, his body shaking as the cold seeped into his bones. The whispering grew louder, the voices indistinct but filled with malice. Jack staggered back from the altar, his mind reeling as the darkness closed in around him. The shadows twisted and writhed, their shapes becoming more defined, more menacing. And then, out of the darkness, they emerged. Figures, twisted and deformed, their eyes burning with a cold, malevolent light. They were not human, not anymore. Their forms were grotesque, their skin stretched tight over sharp lichen and angular bones. They moved with unnatural grace, their limbs long and spindly, their fingers ending in razor-sharp claws. Jack's heart raced as the figures surrounded him. Their eyes locked on him with a hunger that terrified him to his core. He could feel their hatred, their desire to tear him apart, to drag him down into the darkness with them. He backed away, his mind screaming at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The figures closed in, their claws reaching out to tear into him. And then, just as they were about to strike, a blinding light filled the chapel. The figures recoiled, hissing in pain as the light seared their flesh. Jack shielded his eyes, the light too intense to bear. He could hear the figures screeching, their voices filled with agony as the light burned them. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light vanished. Jack blinked, his eyes adjusting to the sudden darkness. The figures were gone, the chapel silent once more. But the sense of dread remained, the feeling that something terrible was still lurking just out of sight. He turned, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of what had just happened. And then he saw it. A figure standing in the doorway, bathed in the faint glow of the moonlight. It was tall and thin, its outline barely visible in the darkness. But Jack knew, without a doubt, that it was the same figure that had been haunting him, the same malevolent presence that had tormented him. But this time there was something different about it. The light that had driven away the shadows still clung to it, wrapping around its form like a protective shield. The figure's eyes glowed with an intense, otherworldly light, and Jack could feel its power, its strength. The figure stepped forward, its movements fluid and graceful. It didn't speak, but Jack could feel its intentions, could sense the force of its will. It was not here to harm him, not anymore. It was here to end this, to put a stop to the darkness that had plagued him. Jack took a deep breath, his fear slowly ebbing away. He knew what he had to do. He had to face the darkness, had to confront the malevolent force that had tormented him. And this time he wasn't alone. The figure moved to stand beside him, its presence a comforting warmth in the cold, dark chapel. Together they turned to face the altar, the symbol on the wall glowing faintly in the darkness. The whispers in Jack's mind grew louder, but he pushed them aside, focusing on the task at hand. He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the symbol. The stone was cold, but beneath it he could feel the pulse of energy, the dark power that had been unleashed so long ago. He could feel the malevolence, the hatred, the hunger for destruction. But he could also feel the light, the force that had driven away the shadows, the power that had saved him. Jack closed his eyes, focusing on that light, on the warmth that the figure had brought with it. He could feel the darkness trying to push back, trying to overwhelm him, but he held on, drawing strength from the figure beside him. Slowly, the darkness began to recede, the whispers fading into nothingness. And then, with a final surge of power, the darkness was gone. The symbol on the wall crumbled, the stone cracking and breaking apart. The oppressive weight lifted from Jack's shoulders, the cold dissipating. The chapel was silent once more, but it was a peaceful silence, the kind that comes after a long, hard-fought battle. Jack opened his eyes, his breath coming in slow, even gasps. The figure beside him was gone, but he could still feel its presence, its warmth. He knew that it had done what it had come to do, that it had helped him to finally put an end to the darkness that had haunted him. He turned and walked out of the chapel, the night air cool against his skin. The forest was quiet, the trees no longer twisted and menacing. The road was just ahead, the car still sitting where he had left it. Jack walked toward it, his steps steady, his mind clear. As he reached the car, he turned and looked back at the chapel. It stood in the clearing, silent and still, its dark history finally laid to rest. Jack knew that he would never forget what had happened, that the memory of the darkness would stay with him forever. But he also knew that he had faced it, that he had fought and won. And as he drove away, leaving Grim Farm behind, Jack felt a sense of peace settle over him. The darkness was gone, the nightmare over. He was finally free. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.